So we left off with the Crusaders forming a handful of Crusader states, most prominently the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and they are surrounded by enemies on all sides. The next closest Christian kingdom, the Byzantines, hate them for not giving back land, and their next closest Christian allies are 1,000 miles away. To make matters worse, heretics and infidels not only surround them, but make up the majority of the Crusader states' population. The Crusader kingdoms had a tiny minority of Catholics ruling over Sunni Muslims, Jews, Armenian Orthodox, Syriani, Jacobites, Shia Muslims, Nestorians, Marianites, Druze, and Samaritans. Surprisingly, the Crusader kings were very chill with their non-Catholic subjects. The reason why is the same reason European kings back then sometimes protected Jews from mobs. Infidels pay taxes, and kings like taxes. Granted, the native non-Catholics in the Crusader states were now second-class citizens, but that's more than you'd expect from something called a Crusader state. The problem is, only Catholics were willing to die to protect the kingdom, and because the Catholic population was so small, so was the Crusaders' army. The Crusader states got a trickle of Catholic immigrant pilgrims from Western Europe, but never enough. In fact, new Catholic immigrants didn't get along well with the descendants of the original Crusaders who founded the kingdom. Newer Catholic immigrants were shocked to find their Middle Eastern brethren had seemed to completely abandon Christ and converted to Islam. And the evidence was plain to see. Just like Muslims, they wore perfume. They ate Muslim food, like dates and oranges, and didn't eat pork. They even dressed like Muslims, wearing flowing white robes like the Saudi oil princes. So, did the Crusaders' descendants forsake Christ and surrender to Allah? No, not at all. People in the Middle East bathed, ate, and dressed the way they did not because they were Muslim, but because they lived in the Middle East. They wore perfume to cover up the body odor from sweating. They ate Middle Eastern food because, fun fact, they lived in the Middle East. They didn't eat pork because their Muslim and Jewish subjects didn't raise pigs for them to eat. Finally, the reason the Crusaders and the Saudis both wear robes isn't because Allah forbids pants, but because robes help improve airflow so they don't melt from the heat. Another big issue the new pilgrims and Crusaders absolutely couldn't understand was why the Crusader kingdoms were allied to Muslim countries. The reason was the same that they ate and dressed the way they did. Pure practicality. The only reason the Crusaders could waltz in the first time was because the Muslim world had fallen apart into many tiny, harmless pieces. But if one of these pieces ever united the others back into an empire, they could easily eat the Crusader kingdoms. So the Crusaders made alliances with these Muslim states to prevent them from eating each other and snowballing into a real threat. This strategy worked for 50 years, until one Muslim ruler named Zengi tried to game the system. Zengi wanted to conquer Odessa, the first and weakest Crusader state, but Odessa had an army defending it. So, in a big brain move, he got the army out by attacking Odessa's Muslim allies. As soon as Odessa's army had left, Zengi then pulled up outside the now defenseless city with his own army, and on Christmas, instead of Santa coming down the chimney, the Turks scaled the walls and took the city. This completely surprised and terrified the other Crusader states. They asked the Byzantines for help, but they ignored them. The Pope didn't ignore them though. Thinking the other Crusader states were in danger, and thinking if it worked once it'd work again, the Pope called for a Second Crusade. Well, Second Official Crusade. History doesn't number all the crusades that fail, only those that fail spectacularly. The bad news was, only one guy was interested. The good news was, that guy was the King of France, and he could make other people do what he wanted. He sent a preacher to go spread the hype, and he even peer pressured the German king into going too. Considering no king went on the First Crusade, this was a big deal. A German and a French army, both led by their kings, began forming. The Germans, always more efficient, were ready to go first. Surprisingly, and out of character, the German army committed nearly no war crimes going through Eastern Europe, and it was definitely because they were good Christians and not because the local king paid them money not to raid them. Just like last time, the Byzantines were not happy to see another crusading mob, but they gave good travel advice anyway. The Byzantines gave the Germans the safest directions, but the Germans wanted to reenact the First Crusade, including their stupid navigation, and took the same route as the first time. Turned out, the Turks were happy to oblige in role-playing and ambushed the German army by Dorylaeum, the same place they ambushed the First Crusade. The knights had learned from the First Crusade and copied the tactics, getting on their horses and charging directly into the Turks. The Turks retreated, but there's an issue. The Turks also learned from the First Crusade. Here's the thing about the Turks. When they retreat, it just means they are waiting for a better time to murder you. So they showed up later when the Germans weren't expecting it and began murdering. The German army spent days running back to the Byzantines. Then most of the survivors just went home. That should have been the end, but judging by the video length, it isn't. The French army showed up in Byzantine territory, where they joined what remained of the Germans. And in a rare historical reversal, the French army proved to have better military tactics than the German army, and accepted Byzantine advice to take the obviously better path. The Turks tried to block their way on a bridge, and the French turned them into confetti. And it looks like everything is looking up for the Second Crusade. Wait, no. Like before, the Turks kept harassing them. They ran out of food and needed to eat their own horses. A full half of the army either died or abandoned ship before finally getting to the Holy Land. But now there was a big Crusader army in the Middle East that could take back Odessa, right? Well, fun fact, no. After Zengi came down with a bad case of getting stabbed, his son, Nuruddin, had a big brain idea. The Crusaders can't take back Odessa if there is no Odessa, so he burned the entire city to the ground. So now the Crusaders need to find a new target to justify their 3,000-mile hike. The Crusader kingdom suggested they could attack the city of Aleppo, but that city wasn't mentioned in the Bible, so they didn't care. You know what city nearby was mentioned in the Bible? Damascus. Tiny problem, Damascus was allied to the Crusader states. However, the Crusader army did with this problem what Crusaders did with most problems and ignored it. In theory, if the Crusaders could have taken Damascus, they would greatly strengthen the Crusader kingdoms and prevent any Muslim state from snowballing. In reality, the entire thing was so short and stupid there's a reason no one ever talks about it. The Crusaders showed up outside the city with an army. Damascus, however, thwarted their brilliant plan by closing the gates. And the Crusaders couldn't do anything about this because they thought their angry love for Jesus would intimidate the city to let them in, so they didn't bring any siege equipment. The Crusaders set up by the trees, but kept getting attacked by Muslims, so they moved to a wide open area. But it's the desert, and without shade, they began boiling alive. After 4 days, they threw up their hands and just left. And that was the end of the Second Crusade. Now, you probably have many questions, the most important one being, why isn't this video over yet? The answer is simple. The Second Crusade was small, but it had big consequences, and they were all bad. Firstly, the Crusades' goal of strengthening the Crusader states not only failed, but backfired catastrophically. After the Crusaders attacked Damascus, the city was so destabilized that when Nuruddin came by, some rebels literally opened the gates and let him in. This means the Crusaders' attempt to stop a giant Muslim state from forming has led to a giant Muslim state now forming, and they are now in big danger. Secondly, the French king was convinced his wife cheated on him during the Crusade, so he divorced her. She then married the King of England, giving future English kings a claim on the French throne. This ultimately led to a tiny conflict between England and France known today as the 100 Years' War. The third and worst regrettable consequence of the Second Crusade was the birth of Portugal. A crusading army took a detour to Spain and helped a little Christian kingdom take over the city of Lisbon from Muslim rule. That would become the new capital of the new country of Portugal. At the end of the day, the Second Crusade, much like this video, was a massive, overblown disappointment. Anyway, if you like the video, like the video. If you want more disappointment, hit the subscribe and bell buttons. And if you like wasting money as much as you like wasting time, my Patreon link is in the description. The Third Crusade will be next. Now go outside and touch some grass.